So again, my name is Mark Nybert. I'm currently an insider threat and user activity monitoring program manager within the Fourth Estate. My background's in network operations, security operations. I've been an ISM. I've done HBSS admin, all kinds of different things. I've done it in Bahrain, so I've been in the Middle East. I've done it in the UK. Done it all over the States. So a lot of the stuff that I see here, as well as some of the things that I've worked through kind of out in the private sector through some of the teaching and training that I've done, as well as the recent experience with the Army War College and working with a lot of our future senior leaders, have definitely identified some of the gaps with, you know, as we start to do cybersecurity and we start to do net ops or we start to do security operations, what are the things that we can do better to improve this? So most of my conversation is going to be kind of within this picture. So as we look at this, these are kind of the stakeholders in cybersecurity command and control. So when you look at this, so these are the different groups within cybersecurity. So we have the SOC, which is your Security Operations Center, and I would classify that as your tactical real-time data detection, to where you have the proactive resources to dig into the network and see the adversaries proactively take action. And that comes also with having the authority, the proper accounts set up, and being able to detect and move things through. The other side of that, the other blue, and these are all coded for red team, blue team. So we have the defensive cyberspace operations and then the CSSP. And those are kind of currently in your passive reactive type of cyber protections. And if you were at the briefing earlier with Mind the Gap, this is exactly kind of what they talked through. So to the right of that, we have our, the DIRT team, so disaster recovery and response team. And again, that's another reactive team that has the capability to immediately respond to networks for incidents and take action. The red team can kind of go both ways. So that's your pen testers, but that also can be, your adversary or offensive attacks, whether it's defensive cyberspace operations, response actions, so the DCORA, or it can be your offensive cyber team that is actively testing against your network to see what your weaknesses and vulnerabilities are. And then up to the top is a small team that I'm most familiar with, which is UAM, which is user activity monitoring. And what that is that's really just a SOC with a different lens. It has a behavioral flair to it. So as you're looking through the network and you notice things such like triggered events that kick off with cybersecurity events, as you see those, there's a behavioral piece to where if somebody's doing things that are against cyber hygiene, right, bad admin practices, it may not necessarily be an insider threat, but when you look at the UAM piece, it can be, because what it happens is you tie in the other half, which is the behavioral piece. So when you look at that, those are things such as, are they in trouble? Did they put in their 2 weeks notice? Are there other data sources that tie into that? So that's where UAM comes in. And I think as we've seen across the globe, especially within the DoD space, the insider threat is a big part of what we deal with, because we're mostly connected, the entire globe's networked, whether that's land, sea, air. Now we have the new cyberspace domain and space. And as we get more and more connected and we go to zero trust and we try to shrink down where people have access to, I think all we're really doing is pushing the threat to more of an insider, somebody that has trusted access to our networks. And then off to the left here, we have the data standards. And I think that, whether we move towards JADC2 or some other, all domain command and control data standardization, some of the key elements that I think would tie all of these together and meet the cybersecurity kind of reporting and protection piece in the middle. In the middle section, there's kind of really where I see the gaps. But as we start to standardize and all communicate and become interoperable, that's where a lot of the success in C2 and how we kind of do operations, or just cybersecurity in general, kind of moves forward. Off to the right, we have the mission partners, and whether that's other federal agencies, federal government, Five Eyes, this is a really good space that as with DISA, we kind of work across that all over the globe. So how do we tie them in? Because we do have missions at all various levels, whether it's unclassified, classified, top secret, REL, NATO. How do we also make sure that we share the information with them in regards to cybersecurity threats, so that there is true defense in depth and we protect the network and we're able to see and identify things quickly. So when we look at this picture, what I see, so off to the top, we have the program manager piece, which initially I had that on every little circle here, but it was a little cluttered. So what we're doing is every one of these groups has a program manager, multiple program managers that are tied throughout that. And they play a critical role with kind of how you manage the teams, build the teams, run the teams. And as we go through this, what you can see here is the big problem set that I see as we look at cybersecurity operations is that each one of these groups typically kind of operates in their own silo. They operate in their own space. So there's a lack of communication across the board. And the example that I can give is that sitting through one of the out briefs for an assessment, you sit through, you go through there, right? The assessments and assumed breach, malicious insider, and you listen to it and you start asking questions. Well, who was involved in this original data set as you went through the problem? And then, the insider threat or UAM team wasn't a part of it, or this blue team was, and here was our small scope from the red team. And I think, as we move forward, what we should look for is if you had had all of these stakeholders or the players in this brief, as you go through and you identify vulnerabilities and you identify breaches, you could say, hey, this was the vulnerability we found. This is what we see as wrong. What did you find? And if every group didn't see the same thing, you can start building out those policies and triggers to make sure that each group has the capability to see all the same things. And the more that we communicate and kind of open up communication with all these different groups, I think the better that we'll be able to detect and deter and take action, at least in the cyberspace. And so what we're looking at here is, C2 of C2 is essentially kind of what DISA does. And that's the space that we're talking about here. So with the DISA's no-fail mission, like I said, we're global, and that's one of the missions that you'll hear today. We're everywhere, and as cybersecurity starts to take prevalence over basic network operations, we have to understand kind of what are those gaps. Earlier today we heard DCO, CSSP, how we close those gaps. We definitely play a role in that as well. When it comes to data standards and interoperability, and you look at like the joint all-domain command and control, whether the JADC2 part of the joint warfighter concept is the answer or something else. I think as we standardize data and we start to get direction from the top and we point down to cyber operations, when that event comes to where all of us are expected to respond to an adversarial attack, we will have the interoperability to where this system works in some sort of multi-domain conflict when we expect it to. Some of the things that to think about as you're forming a red team, a blue team, or even as we transition to what a lot of folks talk about with the purple team, make sure that when you're building out these exercises, tabletops, war games, or even real world events, that we're pulling in all the stakeholders. And again, that's from business sector, from UAM, and the more we kind of move towards the purple team or even purple team plus, where you start bringing in some of the outside teams, I think the better we're going to be, because as you're building through the red team or the blue team, and even within the purple space, what the benefit is as you build offensive capabilities and you attack a network or you attack some sort of enclave, you can work with the blue team or the SOC or the CSSP and understand what you can see and what you can't see as it comes through. And I think as we work together to build out a lot of that space, I think the better we're going to be and the quicker we kind of get to where we need to be within the cyberspace. And then, as we talk about operations, I think one of the things that we're seeing now, right, is we're definitely closing the gap between network operations and cybersecurity. Cybersecurity used to be information security, call it what you will. It's definitely progressed. But as you look at network operations, even when I did my time in Bahrain and we're going through all of the undersea cable cuts and you're dealing with circuits going up and down, there's always that component of what caused that. But we didn't have a whole lot of conversations with the cybersecurity elements out there. So as we move through this, bringing in all of the operational stakeholders, leadership, and then getting it even from down at the operational level to understand what this looks like. And then, as we do, when I say here, like understanding mission overlap and then closing the gaps for mission success, uh, as we start to close the gaps with CSSP, DCO, we start to build out these, proactive security operations centers. I think one of the key things that we have to start to do is not focus on the positions, but focus on the people. Through a lot of the training, a lot of the things that I've met and the people I've dealt with, we have to start figuring out, how do we recruit good people into the DoD, understanding that, obviously the private sector is financially more lucrative at times, but what can we do to start bringing in really good people? One good analyst can do the work of 5 people. So how do we start to understand what that recruiting looks like? Whether that's, through DISA we have the intern program. I mean, that's where I started, and that's how I've kind of worked from the bottom all the way up through here. But what does that look like? How do we start to build those skills? Even if it's more training, internally, externally, how do we start to get the necessary skill sets and actually reward people as you complete those? How do we get them the work that they want to do and keep them hands-on? And that can even be using, the ARE or some of our military folks, and bringing them into our space to actually do hands-on technical work, which I know has always been a challenge. So understanding, how do we do that? Forging partnerships and utilizing innovation, definitely keys to that. And what that means too is, one of the exercises that we did at the War College last year dealt with working at, through DHS or CISA. But what that means is, how do you start to bring in private sector and academia? How do we kind of lower that entry point to start talking with them and utilizing the advanced technologies that they have to start building out, cybersecurity and filling in the gaps within communication. One of the things that I was lucky enough to take part of a couple weeks ago in Florida was a hackathon. What the entire intent was, what can be accomplished in 4 days if you take out a lot of the bureaucracy of the government systems. And it was pretty amazing, some of the things that we were able to accomplish when you actually had access to the best open source tools that you could kind of build and create freely and openly with what you want to do, and there wasn't as many constraints. And this was all done at a CUI environment. But building the trust with private sector, academia, and industry that's here, this is how we start to move forward, and we start to think forward as we start to close some of the gaps within cybersecurity, C2 communications, cybersecurity operations, security operations center, whatever word we want to call it. I think we'll call it the right of bang, or the right of a adversarial attack. How do we ensure that when we need to come together that we can? And it's definitely not kind of working in the siloed existence that we have now, to where all of the cybersecurity elements work in their own little bubble, and then we have the UAN team who does that, and you have a red team who does their things, and they share the outbrief with all of these folks, and then you're expected to fix it. But if we can include everybody from the beginning as we build through this, I think that provides us with a better opportunity to defeat the adversary when we have to. Because the last thing that we want is, as an attack comes in, is to be in the reactive mode, which is unfortunately where we currently operate. And cleanup's much harder to do if you could stop it at the edge or at the boundary. So how do we improve? So I've talked through some of this, but here's kind of my thoughts on how we kind of close the gap. So you start to solidify communications across teams and stakeholders. And these are all the stakeholders that I see. I know that there's probably many more depending on the operation. But as you start to close in the red teams, the blue teams, even audits, inspections, compliance plays a piece of that. When you start with compliance, it builds that baseline of protection. Also understanding that compliance is, a lot of this stuff is out in the public, so the adversaries understand what our baseline is, which makes it more important to ensure that we do close those gaps, because that's where they're going to start. Insider threat, we see it on the news all the time. There's lots of things that have happened because of insiders, malicious insiders, whatever that may be. How do we start to take a look at that and make sure that we can prevent what I would say are some of the easy things and keep the stuff from getting out? And whether that's walking out with paperwork or even from network stuff. And then operations, is a massive scope. So whether that's network operations, security operations, making sure that all the right players are in there. Data standardization is Exactly what it is. It's really how do we kind of standardize the type of data, the type of logs that we see, just to make it easier as we start to build out these products. Uh, as we look at it, right? I mean, there's one side of the fence to where the more we diversify our portfolio and how we offer things, the less attack vectors the adversary has, and then the other side is let's make it all one thing so that it's easier to manage or operate. And I guess, depending on what side you're on, I could go both ways on what's the safest, because having a bunch of different products, if an adversary breaks into a couple of those, makes it extremely more complicated to find things, fix things, and clean it up. Whereas if you don't have that same problem, if you have one product, but on the other hand, one product could be a more massive scale. But as especially within DISA, right? We're the face for a large organization as we go out to meet with a lot of mission partners, a lot of the federal government, a lot of the Five Eyes, the REL. We're the face. I know one of the things when I was out in Bahrain, we took a tour throughout the Middle East to go meet with folks at lots of military bases, and we were the first DISA person they ever seen. And all of DISA's problems, which is a massive scale. I mean, I think we heard earlier, right? 19,000 contractor, military, and civilian employees. We're the first person they've ever met. So every single DISA issue came to us. So how do we take that and find the right people within DISA to handle those things? And I know that's not necessarily cybersecurity, but as we go out and meet people, that's one of the things we have to keep in mind is that although it's a big organization, we work with a lot of folks. A lot of times, we're the first DISA person they've met. So it's really important to keep a good personal relationship with a lot of these folks. And then as we go through some of these things, right, map the overlaps, fill the gaps, identify commonalities. And a lot of that too is, you have to be willing to share some of the bad news. The more we hide the bad news, we don't want to share because, we don't want anybody to know the things that we've done wrong. I think that kind of creates a lot of issues. We have to be willing to kind of open communications within these different siloed groups to fill the gaps, or we're going to keep kind of rolling down the same hill that we are now. So this presentation is a little bit different. Instead of asking you for questions, I'm going to put up how can you help, right? And so anybody that wants to talk, feel free to jump on the mic. But how can industry, how can other folks in the federal sector or the DoD or even DISA, how can we close the gaps? What does that look like? Any thoughts that you have? Feel free to jump up. But how do we build out communications and reporting between different groups and stakeholders? How do we break down the silos of excellence? How do we break down these communication barriers? How do we enforce data standardization and interoperability? That's a huge problem. That's probably nothing that we'll solve here today. If we do, that'd be great. How do we include all the appropriate groups in operations and war games? And how do we start to do more tabletops and exercises that still aren't in these silos? How do we start to be more inclusive and bring people in and make sure that we have all the right players? And there's also a personal piece to that, is that if you recognize that you don't have all the right players on a war game, an operation, even real world operations and things that you do, I think it's all of our responsibility to call that out and make sure we bring in all the right people. Sometimes we kind of have to step over that boundary. We have to step over that line or break into somebody else's lane to get where we need to go with some of this stuff. So what I'm looking for here is what do you see as solutions, recommendations? How do we collaborate? And outside of that, if you have any questions, feel free to stand up and ask. All right. Yeah. I think the mic's on.
For the first one, at the DISA level, is there like an SOP, for incident management that's widely shared and known for when you've got, units, when there's an incident that occurs at a unit and they're trying to report that to those different elements that you had on the screen? Is there a standard that's up to date, that's known across the board of how to sync all the right people and players?
Yeah, so right now I think everybody works in these, operational elements, and they kind of keep everything. And I think that's exactly one of the things we need to do, is to start making sure we share out those. We had a conversation today. We need to do operations the same way across all the different elements of DISA. Um, but feel free if you want to connect after this, and I can make sure that you get at least what I know, what I have, and then we can start to build that out. Because within DISA we have different operational groups that are spread across the globe, and not even all of them always operate at the same time. I mean, so that's some of the stuff we have to start to figure out. And again, we have to start to close the gap between network operations and security operations. They're both the same thing. I mean, while network operations, we care if it's up, down, degraded. The security side of that is like, why is it up or why is it down? Why is it degraded? And what's that line look like? And do we know who to talk to on both sides to make sure that we're kind of swimming the same path?
So for the build out communications and reporting between groups and stakeholders, are all the roles and responsibilities clearly defined for everybody? Because if that's the case, then you should easily be able to pinpoint who does what and have those group of individuals do I don't know, monthly data calls or something like that to share best practices or things that went wrong, stuff like that. But I think the first step is to clearly define everybody's roles and responsibilities, because I know in a lot of, I'm an auditor, sorry
Okay,
guys.
yeah.
And a lot of the things that we do when we come in, a lot of times people aren't really sure what their job really entails. They might be told by management or somebody else that they're responsible for this, but it's not written anywhere, so therefore they can't be held accountable for that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's absolutely it. And how do we start to put jobs out there with requirements that are actually what you come in and do? I mean, I think that's another piece, but roles and responsibilities is huge. And that's something that's hard to get, especially as we cross the gap or the line of, civilian versus contractor, military. But we all have very different scopes of things that we can do. So understanding that better would definitely help. Yeah, go ahead.
So with respect to the first two bullets, has it been considered to use, dashboards as far as data standardization? Can each team create a standard output real time as far as reporting incidents and the what is down and the why is down, and then combining that on a global dashboard? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, one of the battles we find is that, how many different tool sets do we have that do the same thing? And I think as we start to not only standardize the data, but standardize the tool set, that makes that a lot better too. But yeah, that would absolutely kind of get us where we need to go. All right, anybody else? All right, well, I'll go ahead and close it out. Give you back some of your time. It's not a whole panel of people, so it's a little bit shorter than the rest of them. So, but a catch, I'll be here all week. If anybody has anything, you have any ideas that come up, just come let me know. All right, thanks for coming.